right information? Does Appling it sound right? Hi, I'm Ken Ray, and this is episode 206 of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. It is said we're all searching for something. How would you feel about letting Apple handle that search? Speculation has Apple considering a search engine of its own, or some sort of something in search. We'll dig into that on this edition of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. So a big rumor hit at the end of October. Of course, the news cycle being what it is, it was forgotten almost as soon as it hit. We still found it interesting, though, and worth revisiting. So the question is Apple building a search engine to rival Google? Here to talk it over with us is SecureMac writer Nick Leone. Nick, thank you very much for being here again.
Good to be here again.
So let's start with where this story came from.
Well, there was this report published in the Financial Times, and search marketing professionals, the kind of people who pay attention to these things, they started noticing that there was a real increase in Applebot activity. Applebot is Apple's web crawler. It's a bot. It browses the web in order to index and rank web pages and improve search results, right? And also noted in the report was that there's some new search behavior as well in iOS 14.
Okay, how do you mean?
Well, in iOS 14, if you do a search from the home screen now, you don't just get the Google suggestions anymore. You also get Apple's own search results and direct links to websites. So, some people think all of this means Apple's getting into the search business. In other words, it's building its own search engine. And if this is the case, obviously, we're still sort of in the very first stages of it. But the thought is that this is something that could one day rival Google.
Okay, why do people think that this is something they're doing now?
Well, at the moment, Google is Apple's default search engine on iOS. And it's actually thought Google pays Apple in the neighborhood of, I think, $7 billion. I've seen estimates as high as $12 billion to have that top spot, right? And obviously, Google is the big name in web search. The name of the company has become a verb that means to do a web search, right?
Right.
But they may have now gotten too big, legally speaking. So just a couple of weeks ago, the U.S. DOJ, the Department of Justice, filed an antitrust lawsuit against Google, basically calling the company a monopoly and saying they're engaged in anti-competitive behavior, illegal anti-competitive behavior, in order to maintain their dominance. So nobody at this point really knows what's going to come of all this. But if this seems to be the way things are going, if Google's maybe even found guilty of doing the things it's accused of doing, maybe even broken up by regulators eventually, then, it makes sense that Apple would want to have an alternative search engine of its own ready and waiting. And in addition, some people are saying this may have been in the works for some time. If you look at the kind of hiring decisions Apple's been making at the executive level. So in particular, there's somebody called John Gianandrea. He's Apple's senior VP of machine learning and AI strategy. And before he worked at Apple, he worked at Google as head of search before Apple, headhunted him. So, if you were going to try building a search engine, that would be the kind of leadership and expertise you'd want.
Yeah, but you would also think, Apple hasn't said, hey, we're going after Google. We're building an alternative.
No, that's true. But on the other hand, Apple's pretty good at keeping things close to the vest, right? They don't really say why they buy what they buy, or why they hire who they hire at the time. You only find out much later, what it was all about.
Yeah, that's true. I should know actually how they answer that question. I always paraphrase it on my show. On macOS Ken, usually I paraphrase it as, "We don't have to tell you why, so shut up." I know it's a bit more, it's a bit more genteel than that, but only a bit more. So the Financial Times does lean pretty hard into the idea that Apple is going to build a search engine to fight Google. There's the Applebot thing. There's the DOJ thing. There's the executive formerly of Google that you talked about, Gianandrea. And all that makes sense. I see all the reasons that they're laying out, and yet I have trouble seeing Apple do this. I mean, what else could Apple be up to?
Well, there are other alternative explanations. Like, I mean, for one thing, if you look back at somebody like Gianandrea or like the search engineers that Apple's been hiring, I mean, ostensibly these people are being hired to improve Siri, and it could be that that's really just what Apple is up to, right? And that actually that's what people are seeing, right? As people do more Siri web searches, as Apple tries to make Siri better, there's just more Applebot activity. But on the other hand, there are those legal and political factors we were talking about a second ago.
Yeah, you see, that's where I have a hard time buying Apple launching a Google competitor. I mean, which is not to say that they're not doing anything in search. But I mean, like if the DOJ dissolves, the search business relationship between Apple and Google, if the DOJ makes it illegal for Google to pay Apple the billions of dollars people think Google is paying Apple, I mean, Apple making a Google competitor doesn't, suddenly give Apple billions of dollars that it was just being, handed a quarter or two ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid point, definitely. I guess I'd say on the other hand, and this is just my speculation, so take it for what it's worth, but I mean, I think in some ways Apple really does try to be this secure, privacy-focused, kind of one-stop shop for its users. And in a sense, that is its core offering as a company, as much as anything else, maybe even more than the phones or the laptops or whatever. And search is huge, right? It's a huge part of our online experience. And it's also partly due to who Google is as a company, I think. It's also one of the places where, I think a lot of people really feel that they're being tracked, they're being profiled, they're being advertised to. So if Apple could provide a fast, reliable, privacy-friendly search tool natively on its platform, even if it's not making money directly through that, I think something like Apple Search would make the Apple ecosystem that much more attractive for a lot of potential users. And that in itself might make it worthwhile to Apple.
More of our Apple search talk in a moment, but first a word about MacScan 3 from SecureMac. Chances are you're doing more with your computer these days than you were a few months ago, thanks to all the staying in, the social distancing, the schooling at home, the working from home. It's not that you're doing anything particularly risky with your computer, though right now would be a terrible time for something to take you offline. You need a good anti-malware solution like MacScan 3. MacScan 3 is a great defense against malicious software attacks aimed at your Mac. It's developed by SecureMac, trusted names in computer security and developers of exceptional security software for the Mac for over 20 years. MacScan 3 detects and removes Mac malware, catches keyloggers, removes tracking cookies, and provides full-range or targeted scanning, all without crowding up your hard drive or slowing down your machine. Sign up for a free 30-day trial today at securemac.com/MacScan. Then once you decide to buy for less. You can take a little off your subscription to MacScan 3 with offer code CHECKLIST. Try it first, watch it kick those tracking cookies to the curb. Then when you're ready to buy for less with offer code CHECKLIST at securemac.com/MacScan. SecureMac's Nick Leone is here with us today talking over the possibility of Apple getting into a search engine of its own. I guess, the whole thing that we do here is, privacy, security, keeping yourself safe. Apple doing a search engine is kind of an interesting thought exercise, but what would an Apple search functionality mean for privacy?
Well, look, let's be honest. Google's got a pretty spotty track record on privacy. And Apple, on the other hand, they're certainly not perfect, but I think most people would agree they have a pretty good track record on privacy. So a viable Apple search engine that could offer, a real alternative to Google would be a win for users. And, in part, that privacy focus has to do with Apple's principles. But, more pragmatically, Apple's core business just doesn't revolve around selling ads or monetizing user data like Google's does. So it can afford to, literally, it can afford to take a stand for user privacy, even if that antagonizes app developers or digital marketers or whoever that rely on its platforms.
I'm sorry, antagonizes them how?
Well, so for a while, Apple's been, really doubling down on letting users know what permissions apps are asking for on their devices. Last year when they introduced that feature in iOS 13 that let you know when an app was asking for your location data in the background, it made a lot of people unhappy because, it became really apparent that apps were asking for your location data in the background all the time, which, as we all know, is used, to track you, to build a marketing profile on you, et cetera. And, Facebook kicked up a real fuss about it at the time. They even did like a special press release defending how they collect and use location data because people were seeing all of these notifications in iOS 13 saying, app X is asking for your data, asking for your data, right? In iOS 14, as you and I discussed a few weeks ago, users are going to have this ability to shut off this kind of tracking basically with a single switch, right? And stop apps from even asking for it. And that really upset a lot of companies and developers who rely on being able to do this in order to make money. And that certainly includes Facebook, right? And when this was announced, a lot of these companies, these digital marketers, they said, look, you're going to put us out of business. But Apple, to its credit, stuck to its guns. The only compromise they made was extending the time frame that these companies would have in order to get ready for it. They delayed the full rollout of the feature by a few months. I think now it's expected in early 2021.
So in the piece that you wrote for SecureMac about this, you also said that that an Apple search engine could be important because Google's data collection practices have had social and political consequences. And you mentioned that Google gets a lot of geofence warrant requests. Now, I feel like I should know what those are, but can you explain what they are, the geofence warrants?
Yeah, sure. So geofencing in general is when you create like a digital perimeter around a physical area, and it has different uses. Advertisers, businesses use this to make special offers or advertise things to people who are physically near a shop location, things like that. Geofence warrants, on the other hand, are this very controversial investigative technique that law enforcement agencies have been using in the U.S. and using more and more. And what they'll do is they'll go to a tech company and they'll say, look, we want all the data you have on devices that were in this area on this day between these hours, because they figure they can use that data to help track somebody down who is suspected of a crime or place them in the area or whatever, something like that. And, likely because of the amount of information Google collects on its users, Google gets a ton of these geofence warrants. People who, observers who have studied this say Google gets far more of these requests than other companies. And so this worries, privacy-minded groups like EFF or the ACLU, but it also worries, even U.S. federal judges who say law enforcement's really overused these warrants. And to be clear here, Google's not doing anything wrong, right? They have to comply with warrants and court orders just like any company. But if they're collecting and storing information about their users, then the information is there to be turned over. And so I think this is where search run by Apple might be preferable. As we said, a large part of Google's business is built on data collection, be that where users go or what users search for. And based on its privacy stance, if Apple got into search, one assumes that it would not be collecting and storing this information. And when we talk about search data, I don't know. I mean, that's a big part of our lives online, a big part of our privacy. Frankly, I think people who are concerned about civil rights, citizen privacy, might prefer to see their searches handled by Apple rather than Google, considering the difference in the way the two companies approach data collection, user privacy, etc.
See, the one place that I get stuck is when we talk about Apple building a search engine. Would Apple build a search engine that I would go to applesearch.com the way I go to google.com right now, or DuckDuckGo, actually, if it's me? Or is it just something that's going to be built in? I mean, it feels to me like the focus on machine learning on a better, Siri would accomplish the same kind of thing that we're talking about. So like I say, rather than going to Google or rather than Siri going to Google or Siri going to DuckDuckGo, it seems like Apple could make its own search thing that wouldn't even look like a service to Apple users. It would just be users, picking up their phone, asking a question, and having their phone answer that question. Or maybe even machine learning knowing you well enough to anticipate what you might need or want, which, is kind of unsettling in its own way, but hopefully not a way that lands you, on some list, be it a marketing list or a law enforcement list or whatever.
Yeah. Well, honestly, right at this point, it's kind of a game of wait and see, as it always is when we're talking about new Apple technology. So we'll have to see how or if this plays out. But I think the prospect of an Apple alternative to Google search makes this a story worth watching. And until then, I don't know. I guess you can always, as you have, change your default engine. Your default search engine is something other than Google. DuckDuckGo, as you said, is a good privacy-friendly option.
Yeah, and hey, well, let's give people something to do if they want to. I know we've done it before, but if somebody does want to change, there are a few things. First of all, there's more than just Google or DuckDuckGo. So if people just want to get off Google, or if they want to go ahead and have DuckDuckGo be their default search, it's the same way to do both of those things. Can you tell people how to change that?
Yeah. So on iOS, you go into settings and you'll see a search section. You click on search engine, and by default, it's set to Google if you haven't changed it. But you'll see options to change it to other search engines. I think Yahoo, Bing, or DuckDuckGo. And, so whatever your preference is, again, DuckDuckGo is, their goal is to build a privacy-focused search engine. So they're not about tracking users. So if that's something you're concerned about, it's a good way to go.
I mentioned earlier that Nick writes for the SecureMac site. If you go to securemac.com/news, you can keep up with some of what he's keeping up with. You can also follow him on Twitter at Nick Leon Ruiz. That's NickLeonRuiz at Nick Leon Ruiz. And thanks again to Nick Leon for joining us today. Hey, if you're looking for more security news and how-tos, the place to look is securemac.com/checklist. There you'll find notes for this show, for the last show we did, for all the shows all the way back to the very first one, and you can listen right there as well. It all starts at one place, securemac.com/checklist. If you like the checklist, would you do us a favor? Leave us a review, maybe a rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. And if you have a question you would like to ask or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. That address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. And we'll talk to you next week.